The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's an honor to rise today to speak to Bill C-97, an honor but also a concern. It's also an honor and a privilege to bring the concerns of my constituents of the North Okanagan Shuswap to this House and debate them as their Member of Parliament. It's perhaps the greatest honor I've ever known, aside from being blessed with a loving wife and becoming a parent. It is to represent the people who have entrusted me to carry their issues and their best interests forward on their behalf and for the good of Canada. Mr. Speaker, I believe we've all come to this place with the intention of representing our ridings and the great people in them, and some of us are very successful at it. But with what I've seen over the last 3.5 years is a government and a Prime Minister who has strayed away from representing the people, and they have put in place a bureaucracy and a larger government with priorities far ahead of what the average Canadian's needs are. The most glaring example of that is this government's out-of-control spending, the lavish sense of entitlement of this Prime Minister, and the ballooning budgets that we see year after year after year. Bill C-97 is an act to implement certain provisions of the budgets tabled in Parliament on March 19, 2019. It's 396 pages. Not a massive omnibus bill, but massive in its own right. But this budget, again, adds almost another $20 billion in deficit. This is multiple years now that this has been happening with this government, and they're out of control spending. Most people have difficulty envisioning what $20 billion would look like. A big $20 billion pile is very hard to envision. Most average Canadians can't quite put that picture together. Well, when I'm talking to the good people in my riding of North Okanagan Shuswap, I explain to them that the $20 billion increase to debt that this government seems to be putting forward every year works out to about $540 for every individual. Every man, woman, and child, every veteran, every senior, every grandparent, another $540 per year, year after year after year, that this government is taking out of their pockets. Then I asked them if they can envision what those dollars would look like in their hands and what they could do with that money in their pockets. That's when they start to get really angry. They realize that they could do far better with the dollars in their pockets rather than sending them to an out-of-control government with out-of-control spending habits. But then I also explained to them, especially those in the workforce, that they're actually on the hook for double that amount, over $1,000 for every working person, because only 50% of Canadians are employed full-time and might be able to pay back some of this debt that this government is piling on. That is when they get really upset and ask what we can do, and ask that we do everything we can to eliminate this out-of-control government and their out-of-control spending. Mr. Speaker, average Canadians must base their lives on what they can earn and what they can borrow and pay back within their working years. Average Canadians understand these principles and strive to pay off their debts and provide a starter investment for their children, or leave a little bit of an inheritance for their children or grandchildren, whatever that may be, but it's what they strive for. In contrast, we currently have a Liberal government that thinks nothing of spending beyond not just their means, but the taxpayers' means. That's really what this comes down to, is a government that is spending beyond the taxpayers' means right now, adding debt year after year after year. This is a government that does not believe in setting aside anything for a rainy day, and instead of leaving something in the bank for future generations, they are passing on a massive debt load that current and future taxpayers are going to have to pay back. On top of this increasing debt load, they're passing on that. On top of this increasing debt load that they are passing on, they have sent hundreds of millions of dollars of spending offshore. Upon joining the Asian Infrastructure Bank, this government committed Canada to roughly 1% share of the bank, worth about $256 million, all going to be spent over the next 5 years. Now, when I explain that to the good people back home in the North Okanagan Shuswap, they start to envision what those kind of dollars could have done back home. When I talk to people there, they think of the projects that we've talked about in my pre-budget consultations that I do every year. I go around to every community, to every First Nations, to the Chambers of Commerce and meet with their boards and ask them what they would like to see in the budget. I compile all of that into a condensed version, as condensed and concise as I can, and provide it in a letter to the finance minister well in advance of the annual budget each year. Unfortunately, what we see back isn't reflective of what average Canadians need. Mr. Speaker, the dollars that are being spent offshore in the Asian Infrastructure Bank are going to build pipelines in China. They're going to build major projects overseas, but there are no Canadian operations involved in those projects. All of that funding is simply going offshore rather than putting Canadians to work. That is what really upsets the people back home when I tell them that. When they've requested funding and support for youth space in a small community like the village of Chase, so that their youth can have a place to go to be active rather than out on the street. Or a community like Sicamous that has put forward the idea of a joint project involving the community and the local First Nations band, Splatsin band. They can see the project, they could see what it could do for the community and the revenue generation that it could create. But those funds aren't there, partly because this government has decided to send it offshore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see I have two minutes left. Again, I've seen requests from communities asking for help in purchasing emergency equipment or upgrading their fire halls. And again, that funding is not available because it's been sent offshore, or it's being spent to service the increasing debt, as we've heard about in some of the speeches this afternoon. The debt service costs because of the increasing deficit that this government continues to pile on. Mr. Speaker, I've also heard of communities asking for a little bit of a kickstart in developing economic plans. First Nations bands have asked me about this. Small communities have asked me about this, how they could possibly get some assistance in guidance in putting an economic plan together. Again, the money wasn't available because it was spent elsewhere. We've heard much talk about the mortgage stress test that has been placed here. And I hear a lot back home about the shortage of housing that's affordable. And I term that a little differently, Mr. Speaker. I term it under housing that is affordable. Affordable housing, that term rings to most people as being low income, income assisted or payment assisted housing. But it's housing that's affordable at all levels that we see. And I believe it's not just in my community, but it's right across the country. For every chance we have to move someone into their first home or into a retirement home or a rental home opens up an opportunity for someone else. Those kinds of things are what I'm seeing being asked for by average Canadians in my riding. They're asking for things like highways improvement. They're asking for things like electrification of a small community of Seymour Arm that's currently off the grid and using diesel generation to power their community. Those kind of things that would really help the small communities move forward and get together, but the funds aren't available because this government is deciding to use them on lavish vacations or offshore spending or servicing the debt. I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Lac-Saint Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened intently to the Honourable Member's speech, and indeed, fiscal responsibility